Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Bunnerong Cemetery, which was a historic cemetery that was located in Sydney's southeast. It's currently called Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park. Bunnerong Cemetery no longer exists. So a few weeks ago I filmed a video at Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park and I've decided not to release that video. I instead wanted to focus on the mystery that I uncovered while I was researching that video. So to explain Bunnerong Cemetery, I first need to go back and talk about the earliest burial grounds in Sydney. So in the earliest days of the colony, they used what was called the Old Sydney Burial Ground. And that cemetery was just kind of a mess. There were no regulations, they just buried people kind of all over the place. They weren't in any denominational sections. In the later days of the burial ground, people said it smelled bad because the bodies weren't buried deep enough and animals were getting into the burial ground and digging up bodies. So Governor Macquarie decided to build a new burial ground just outside of town, and they called it the Devonshire Street Cemetery. So the site of the old burial ground was where Town Hall in Sydney now stands, so it's right in the middle of the city. The Devonshire Street Cemetery, it ran for a while and they buried new people in there too, but the government decided to build Central Railway Station back in 1901, and the location they chose was where the Devonshire Street Cemetery was. So now they needed to move the Devonshire Street Cemetery, and this is where Bunnerong Cemetery comes in. It was purpose-built to house the remains of all of the people that were moved from the Devonshire Street Cemetery. So Botany Cemetery was already there, and they figured it was remote enough that they could put the Devonshire Street remains just right next to it. So Bunnerong Cemetery was the western side of Botany Cemetery. They weren't going to put any new interments in there. It was just going to be sort of a memorial cemetery for the earliest Sydney pioneers. So Botany Cemetery Trust was given a stipend by the government to upkeep the grounds of Bunnerong Cemetery as well. And they also built a caretaker's cottage and put a caretaker in there. In 1901, they started the huge process of digging up all the headstones and remains from Devonshire Street. The government put out a notice that any relatives or friends could come and claim the remains and have them sent to the cemetery of their choice at government expense. So lots of the remains went to Rookwood or Randwick or other places, but the vast majority ended up going to Bunnerong. There were over 16,000 remains and almost 3,000 headstones that were loaded up onto trams at Devonshire Street and sent out to Botany. Minister for Public Works at the time said, "The remains have been removed to a beautiful cemetery where for all time they may rest. I propose to cultivate the ground, to plant shrubs and flowers, and to appoint a trust that will for all time have the care of the cemetery." Lovely, right? Okay, so for years after that, the cemetery basically rotted. There were news articles in the 1940s about the neglected state of it, that there were weeds and rabbit holes everywhere. Botany Cemetery, which was fast running out of space, had been applying to move into Bunnerong Cemetery for new burials, but with no luck. So in 1965, the government grant that Botany Cemetery Trust had been receiving to upkeep Bunnerong Cemetery was stopped. So that left Botany Cemetery to take care of it on their own. But it sounds like they weren't really looking after it anyway. So in 1965, supposedly Botany Cemetery Trust did an investigation of the Bunnerong Cemetery, where the results were that there were actually no bodies there, no remains. This didn't make any sense to me, but they said that all of the ground was hard, like strata rock that nobody could have even been buried under anyway. But they said that they found just 3 lead baby-sized coffins, no remains of pioneers. They said that there were just headstones with nothing underneath them. I tried to get a copy of this investigation, but Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park were a bit cagey about handing over anything to do with Bunnerong Cemetery. So once again, Botany Cemetery were applying in the 60s to be able to reuse Bunnerong Cemetery. They said that they were going to use jackhammers to blast through the rock, and that way they'd be able to bury people there. So they decided that what they'd do would be to collect any of the headstones that they thought were particularly nice or historically valuable and just move them up into one little corner and dispose of the rest. And that's exactly what they did. From my research, I found two different stories. One was that they took all of the headstones and they dug a huge hole and buried them in like landfill. The other story is that they dumped all of the headstones into Botany Bay. So out of the nearly 3,000 headstones that they originally had, only around 700 they kept. All of the rest were disposed of. And the 700 odd were moved up into the far northwest corner, which they now call the Pioneer Memorial Park. Now, aside from what a huge travesty that was, just throwing away all of that history just so they could make a few extra dollars selling burial plots, I couldn't help wondering where all of the bodies were. 16,000 people were moved from Devonshire Street Cemetery back in 1901, so where were they? I've been thinking about this and I've come up with 3 theories, so here they are. Okay, theory number 1, they never moved the bodies. Back in 1901, they just loaded all of the headstones onto trams and put them out at the Bunnerong Cemetery, and the bodies remained under Central Railway Station. Just to haunt the commuters and be like, why did you build on top of us? Why can't we rest in peace? Now I'll tell you why I don't like this theory. I think that it's highly unlikely that the government could have gotten away with such a conspiracy at the time. There were so many news articles and memoirs written by people of the day that described what was unearthed at Devonshire Street and describing the coffins being loaded onto trams heading for Botany. I mean, all of these eyewitness accounts must count for something. Theory number 2. Botany Cemetery simply left the remains there and then just buried on top of them. So remains on top of remains. The old ones would be fairly disintegrated, I guess. So I guess this is possible. I don't know how hard it would be to get away with this, but I suppose they could have just swept away the headstones and resold the burial plots and no one would be any the wiser. Theory number 3 is that when they removed the 2,000 odd headstones that they dumped in either landfill or Botany Bay, they also dumped all of the remains. This is my favorite theory. I think that it's possible that they just unearthed the whole lot, buried it or dumped it, and then were able to on-sell the land. And I only lean towards this theory because I feel like the other 2 theories just are a little bit weak. So do you have any other theories? Can you figure out what might have happened? Because it seems like all 3 of these possibilities are such an undignified and unceremonious end to Sydney's earliest pioneers. So I've been to the local libraries and local historical societies and they just had no information on this either. I just can't believe that nobody has looked into it or nobody cares where these remains have ended up. It's 16,000 people and some of them are totally well-known early settlers too. For example, James Squire, the early convict who started a brewery, which is still around today. There was John Dunn, the bushranger, and there was George Howe, the guy who started the Sydney Gazette, the first newspaper in Australia. And there was Simeon Lord, the guy who started the Bank of New South Wales. So these aren't all a bunch of nobodies, they're important early pioneers and their remains are just missing. This is Sydney's early history, people should care. Anyway, please let me know what you think in the comments section. I would love to hear your theories or whether you agree with any of mine. Or if you've managed to solve this mystery, please let me know. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and I'll see you in my next video. Bye. Welcome to the First Fleet Memorial in the Pioneers Cemetery. All aboard.